Hello and welcome to Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharonjit Lail in Singapore. The headlines. A letter from North Korea for President Trump to be handed over at the White House on Friday. The trade war is back on. The US imposes tariffs on steel and aluminium, and Europe, Canada and Mexico retaliate.
I'm Kasia Madeira in London, also in this programme. After visiting Malaysia, the Indian Prime Minister arrives in Singapore. It's all about business and the rise of the Indo-Pacific region. And the paradise location featured in the film The Beach is closed to protect coral and marine life from tourists.
Live from our studios in Singapore and London. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Good morning. It's 8 a.m. here in Singapore, 1 a.m. in London and 8 p.m. in New York, where on Friday, one of President Kim Jong-un's closest aides will hand-deliver a letter from the North Korean leader to President Donald Trump. It'll be another step in facilitating an historic summit due to take place right here in Singapore. From New York, the BBC's Nick Bryant has been following developments.
The Kim summit dominated the New York tabloids this morning, although this one involved a Kardashian rather than a Korean. Two reality TV stars in a made-for-Instagram moment. Pop and political culture are becoming harder to tell apart. This dinner in Manhattan last night may have lacked the same star power, but was far more momentous. A smiling US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, meeting a North Korean General Kim Yong-chol, a one-time spy master and his leader's right-hand man. Steak was on the menu, and that summit in Singapore.
The fact that even this meeting is taking place shows how rapidly and how dramatically relations between America and North Korea have changed. Less than 9 months ago, Donald Trump was just up the road at the United Nations, threatening to totally destroy that country.
Today's meeting felt like diplomatic speed dating. It was over quicker than expected. And that was a sign of great progress, according to the Americans, and also an indication of how much both sides want this summit to take place.
Our two countries face a pivotal moment in our relationship in which it could be nothing short of tragic to let this opportunity go to waste. I believe they are contemplating a path forward where they can make a strategic shift, one that their country has not been prepared to make before.
The North Koreans are carrying a personal letter from Kim Jong-un to Donald Trump, and tomorrow in Washington they'll make a remarkable journey, walking through the doors of the White House to deliver it. And just a week after cancelling the summit, the president has now indicated there could be multiple meetings.
Hopefully we'll have a meeting on the 12th that's going along very well, but I want it to be meaningful. It doesn't mean it gets all done at one meeting. Maybe you have to have a second or a third, and maybe we'll have none. But it's in good hands, that I can tell.
Whether the two sides even agree on what's meant by denuclearization is still unclear, but it does look increasingly likely that Air Force One will soon be on a flight path to Singapore. Nick Bryant, BBC News, New York.
So quite an optimistic outlook about that potential US-North Korean summit going ahead, but within the last few hours, North Korea's state news agency said that the country's leader, Kim Jong-un, has agreed to hold a summit with Russia. Now, that announcement followed a visit to North Korea by the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. A little earlier, I was able to speak to our State Department correspondent, Barbara Pletasha, and I asked her how the US will react to this announcement.
I think probably with wariness, because it brings another major power into the picture. The foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, has been in Pyongyang meeting with the North Koreans, and he offered this invitation to Kim Jong-un to visit Moscow, and apparently Mr. Kim has accepted. It's not clear when exactly he'll go. Probably it would be easier for the prospects of the summit success if he went afterwards. But again, that is something the Americans will be keeping an eye on. Also, the North Korean state news agency quoted Mr. Kim as saying he wanted to solve these issues of denuclearization on a stage-by-stage basis. which is, again, something the Americans don't want. They want quite rapid and concrete disarmament before they offer any sanctions relief. But the Russians, Mr. Lavrov, has offered support for this phased approach that the North Koreans want to take. So I think it all shows that any negotiations will be still quite difficult, even if the summit with Donald Trump does go ahead.
And we're hopeful about that. We're quite expectant about what is going to be in the letter that the North Korean delegation will hand over to the president. We're expecting that later on Friday.
Yes, that's right. Kim Yong-chol will be delivering it himself. So that is a sign that the summit does seem to be back on track, even though it hasn't been officially announced yet. But you remember last week when President Trump canceled the summit, he did so by writing Kim Jong-un a letter saying, conditions weren't appropriate because of the hostile and angry statements. But if Mr. Kim had a change of heart, he should feel free to write or call. So it seems that Kim Jong-un has taken him up on that and written a letter, and that is what what the general will be delivering. Again, a sign, I think, of the success of the talks here in New York and elsewhere, trying to prepare the groundwork for that summit to go ahead.
Barbara Pletasha there in New York. Well, that meeting, that potential summit with North Korea is not the only thing that is preoccupying the US president, because President Trump has made good on a campaign promise by slapping hefty tariffs on imports of steel and also aluminium. We were always expecting that, but the list of countries that the president has targeted with these tariffs have caused quite a stir. The allies include the EU, Canada and Mexico. They are all on that list, and they've been quick to promise a retaliatory measure. Here's what the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had to say.
The American administration has made a decision today that we deplore, and obviously is going to lead to retaliatory measures, as it must, but we regret that. We would much rather move together in partnership, understanding that no two countries have economies as interwoven and mutually beneficial as Canada and the United States.
Justin Trudeau. Well, also making news today, Italy looks like it is finally about to get a new government. Giuseppe Conte says that he's accepted an offer, in fact, to lead a governing coalition. Just last week, he turned down the job when the president vetoed his choice for economy minister. The announcement ends weeks of political uncertainty that have spooked European financial markets, as our Europe editor explains.
We now have the Five Stars saying that agreement has been reached with the League Party. They have their list of ministers ready. They've been in with the Italian president today, so it's now just seen as a matter of hours before this government could be formally announced.
And another political crisis in southern Europe is brewing, with Spain's Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy fighting for his political life. The opposition socialists are trying to remove him with a motion of no confidence over corruption allegations. A small Basque nationalist party says that it will back the move, and their 5 votes should be enough to topple Mr. Rajoy as soon as Friday. A British man has pleaded guilty to terrorism charges over a plot to attack Britain's Prince George. 32-year-old Hussein Rashid posted information online encouraging jihadis to carry out attacks on the 4-year-old prince at his school in southwest London. Rashid was told to expect a very lengthy prison sentence. Now, the threat from volcanic eruptions on Hawaii's Big Island simply show no signs of easing. These pictures show lava spewing to around 60 meters up into the air. And as you can see, this fast-moving molten stream from Kilauea volcano is cutting a path through just about everything that it is coming across. These latest eruptions have forced more people from their homes.
Now, defence ministers from across the world are gathering here in Singapore this weekend for the International Institute for Strategic Studies Shangri-La Dialogue as the region's leading security and defence summit. Both the US Secretary of Defence, James Mattis, and India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, will be speaking at the event. High on the agenda will be the North Korean nuclear crisis. Our correspondent Karishma Vaswani caught up with Tim Huxley. He's the executive director of the IIS, and asked him what the US's priorities in the region are.
The first task for an American leader in this region when he's talking about America's security role is to provide reassurance to America's allies, partners and other countries that would like to see the United States continuing its regional security role on a long-term basis.
It does seem, though, that any form of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula would come with some sort of U.S. withdrawal from this region. How do you view that as a possible scenario?
That would be deeply disturbing for both South Korea and Japan because they would be left to defend themselves more than is the case at the moment. So I think the United States will need to be very careful to reassure both Seoul and Tokyo about the nature of any deal with North Korea.
India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is the keynote speech at this dialogue. How much of a counterbalance can India pose to China?
I think the inclination of Modi's government is to cooperate as much as possible with China. China has an important role to play in India's economy, and I don't think that India is predisposed to get into an arms race with China. However, China is doing some very disturbing things in India's backyard. So I think this predisposes India to collaborate more closely with other partners, Japan and Australia, as well as the United States. But I don't think that India is going to be enthusiastic about entering into any sort of arrangement that might look like some effort to contain China.
And that was Karishma Vaswani speaking to Tim Huxley there. Well, you're watching Newsday on the BBC. Still to come on the programme, a New Zealand comedian using his act to save the lives of young people with depression.
Also coming up on the programme, why Thailand's authorities are closing a Hollywood paradise in order to save it from tourists.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharanjit Lail in Singapore.
And I'm Kasia Madeira in London. Our top stories. On Friday, a letter from North Korea's leader will be hand-delivered to President Donald Trump at the White House. It'll be another step in facilitating a summit in Singapore.
The European Union, Canada and Mexico say they will retaliate against the United States for pressing ahead with tariffs on imported steel and aluminium. And all the good women have already been snapped up. Well, that's just one of the number of excuses given by top companies in the UK for not appointing women to senior positions. The excuses have been released as a part of a report commissioned by the British government into gender balance. Others included, we have one woman already, and the issues are extremely complex. That story and those excuses is proving a popular story on bbc.com. Let's take a look now at some of the front pages from around the world. We can start with the Financial Times, which is leading with the trade war we reported on earlier with the EU, Canada and Mexico. Of course, its headline reading that the US fires the first shots in trade war with its allies, and we'll probably see a tit-for-tat round of tariffs over the new tax on steel and aluminium imports. Over to Japan now, where the Japan Times is focusing on those high-level talks between the US Secretary of State and senior North Korean officials. And there's a picture of Mike Pompeo. He's showing the North Koreans the view in New York. And finally, the New York Times has a story about a search and rescue mission for a wooden boat carrying Rohingya refugees. Its front page is dominated by this picture, this photo of a search in international waters off the Andaman Sea. The refugees were trying to reach Malaysia, but were reportedly intercepted by Myanmar authorities. Well, that brings you up to date with some of the papers. Kasia, what are the stories sparking discussions online?
Well, Sharanjit, there's still a lot of shock online about that surprise announcement by Zinedine Zidane. Fans are simply stunned that the coach of Real Madrid football team has decided to step down less than a week after leading the Spanish club to a third straight Champions League triumph. Many are saying gracias to him on social media, many are acknowledging his many achievements, and many are describing him as a legend.
Now, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has arrived in Singapore on a 3-day visit at the invitation of Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. Before arriving here, he's been in Malaysia, where he met his newly elected counterpart, Mahathir Mohamad, and before that, he was in Indonesia, where both countries signed a number of pacts to enhance trade ties. Well, Subramanya Jaishankar is the former Foreign Secretary of India. He joined me here in the studio earlier. I asked him what Prime Minister Modi hoped to achieve on his visit.
I think the important part is that within 3-4 months of our ASEAN summit in Delhi, he's here in Singapore, which has been the gateway for India and ASEAN. He was in Malaysia very early to meet the new Prime Minister there. He had a very solid visit to Indonesia. Overall, I think the fact that you have an Indian Prime Minister here indicates a priority, indicates a degree of commitment, which I think ASEAN welcomes very much.
You say it's commitment, but how much of this commitment is a counter to the rise of China in this region?
You know, I'm not sure I would necessarily see this as countering China. India has a long historical association. And if you look at our stakes, the economic stakes, the security stakes, the fact that we have a community here, the fact that there's a very strong Indian cultural influence here, I think all of that really, India is a player in its own right.
Mm-hmm. Now, we know that India is playing a much more strategic role in the region. The Prime Minister is due to give a speech on this later today. But how much is India now playing a somewhat supportive role to the US to sort of counter that rise in China, particularly when the US is starting to use language like the Indo-Pacific century?
Well, look, the US may have started using the language now. The language has been, the concept has been around for a number of years. Again, I think what you are seeing in many ways is a rise of India, an increase in its influence, a willingness to step forward to take on responsibilities. And I again would emphasize that, you know, rather than see it negatively in terms of countering someone, there is a merit. I think the ASEAN has long held a viewpoint that India should step forward more. They would like to see an Indian security presence, a greater Indian economic presence. Right. The fact is today the bulk of India's trade comes from east of India. So does a lot of its natural resources.
Indeed. And if you could tell us a little bit about what he is due to talk about in this sort of strategic speech that he is due to deliver at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is a meeting of very high-level defense chiefs.
Look, you know, my sense is that the message would be of India as a stabilizing force. While we are right now speaking of the ASEAN, I would draw your attention to the fact that a month ago, Prime Minister Modi had a very good meeting, an informal summit with President Xi. Right. The message out of that was really that India and China need to stabilize their relationship. Right. And in fact become a factor of stability in what is a very uncertain world.
The former Foreign Secretary of India speaking to Sharanjit a little bit earlier. Now, it may come as a surprise to hear that New Zealand has the worst teenage suicide rate in the developed world. Just last year, 155 teenagers killed themselves. Well, stand-up comedian Mike King has used comedy all his life to hide his own problems with drugs, alcohol and mental health. Now, Mike is leading a movement to change the way that depression is dealt with.
I'll put up a post on Facebook, suddenly people go like, oh yeah, that feels good, whoa, I'm being like, and then someone writes 40% of kids in school will have a major crisis in their life, often associated with some type of suicidal thinking. How many people here in this room right now are in a great stage of their life and feeling good about themselves? Stand up. Thank you, sit down. How many people here are struggling right now? Please stand up. All you dudes who are sitting down, man, look around, look around, look around. These are the brave ones, man. My name's Mike King. I was a stand-up comedian for over 20 years. But my whole life, my comedy has been a mask. Most of your parents know me as a brash, overconfident, sweary stand-up comedian.
What your parents probably don't know about me is I'm a drug addict, I'm an alcoholic, and I've had self-esteem issues for most of my life. Last year, 155 young people took their lives in our country, 155. Having problems and thoughts won't kill you, but holding on to those problems and holding on to those thoughts, thinking that you're the only one that goes through it, that's the killer. Yeah, a lot of people tell me that suicide, depression, mental health isn't a subject to be joked about. The problem with that is it creates fear. Like, our kids don't know what suicide is. Our kids know what it is. They know what suicide is. Their friends are doing it. There's two things our kids want. They want to be loved, and more importantly, they want to know that their thoughts and opinions are valued by the significant adults in their life, and it's not happening. We just need to love ourselves. I mean, I don't love myself yet, but I can tell you what, I'm starting to like myself a little bit.
The comedian Mike King there with an important message. Now, for a time, it was one of the world's most famous beaches, a secluded bay in Thailand, which featured in the film The Beach. Well, it's now been closed by the authorities to protect it from environmental damage. The thousands of tourists who flocked to Maya Bay are now threatening the coral and marine life around it. Steve Holden from the BBC's Newsbeat reports.
In the film, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Richard, stumbles across paradise. In reality, it's now become an extremely busy paradise.
Thousands of tourists descend here on Maya Bay on Koh Phi Phi every day. And getting that photo to make it look like you're the only one here, well, that's tricky.
We came here and we didn't think it would be this busy, but it's still really good, isn't it?
Yeah, really good.
How do you manage to take a photo where you're the only ones in it?
No, literally it's what we're trying to do now, near the long tail boats. It's so difficult.
Literally.
And obviously you can see it's so busy.
Most tourists only stay for a couple of hours before leaving on one of the many boats that dock here. But environmentalists say that is damaging what's under the water.
We have the scientific information that all the boats that come in and out really impact our coral reef. I have been there for 37 years. After the beach movie, more people come, everything destroyed. I just would like to remember it in my memory.
A decision was made earlier this year to shut Maya Bay from the beginning of June. When it opens 4 months later, the plan is to visit visitor numbers to around half what they are now and ban speedboats from docking in the bay.
I think we just thought we were entering some serene, empty, white beaches by ourselves, and if you look around, it's not so empty, but it's still beautiful.
Thailand is receiving more tourists year on year, and some say that means it's not just Maya Bay that needs protecting. When Danny Boyle made The Beach, he probably didn't think Maya Bay would become the draw that it is today. Tourism brings huge amounts of money into Thailand, but authorities have to make sure that doesn't come at a cost to the environment in the long term. Otherwise, the very beauty that people come here for could be ruined forever. Steve Holden, BBC News, Koh Phi Phi.
Still a stunning beach. Well, you've been watching Newsday. Stay with us, because coming up we'll be taking a more in-depth look at those tariffs that the US has slapped on the European Union, Canada and Mexico, and how those countries pledge to hit back.
And if you were watching yesterday's programme, you'll remember some images that we showed you of the world's largest known freshwater pearl. Well, I can bring you a news update because it fetched more than $370,000 at auction in the Netherlands. It's got an amazing history. It was owned by the Russian Empress Catherine the Great. It's believed to have been formed in Chinese waters in the 8th century. And if you think it looks animal, well, you're not the only one. It is known as the sleeping lion. If you look closely, you can just about make out a lion.